Now, welcome to The World Today, a program of Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. We're the University of Pennsylvania's global affairs think tank, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy during these unprecedented times. My name is Michael Horowitz, and I'm the interim director of Perry Worldhouse and a political science professor. Today's guest is retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. For his last assignment, as many of you know, General McMaster served as National Security Advisor during the Trump administration. He currently sits at Stanford University, where he's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, as well as the Freeman Spogli Institute, and has a variety of other appointments. He had a distinguished military career, which included multiple tours of battle across several different wars. He's also a prolific scholar and author, including his first book, Dereliction of Duty, with more on the way. But more important, he's a native of Philadelphia, the home of Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's also a distinguished visiting fellow with us at Perry Worldhouse. So we are delighted to have him join us today. Sir, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike, thanks for helping me. And just right up front, I want to say how much I appreciate the help that you and Perry Worldhouse and your colleagues across the various departments and graduate students helped with refining the book that I just completed. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Perry Worldhouse. Your mission, I think, is more important than ever. So it's a privilege to be with you.
Thank you very much. And so why don't we start with a question based on a recent article that you wrote in The Atlantic. You wrote that Western liberal qualities that the Chinese see as weaknesses are actually strengths. And there's a lot of discussion right now about how to balance, surveillance and security and, privacy and free speech. How can free and open societies, how do we leverage that to our advantage during this pandemic?
Well, I think we just have to be cognizant of the great gift that we have in our democratic form of government and in our free and open society relative to a closed authoritarian system such as that in China. And so I think there's been a lot of reporting. There's a common understanding of how China not only mishandled, this epidemic that grew into a global pandemic initially, but covered it up, in a way that was damaging to its own people and damaging to the world. And then not only covering it up, by sanctioning the doctors who were just trying to collaborate with each other to clarify what was happening and to make clear that human-to-human transmission was going on. The government actually then mandated that people praise Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, threw out reporters, U.S. reporters and others who were in a position to report on this pandemic. Pressured the World Health Organization, which the Chinese Communist Party has effectively subverted, like many other international organizations. And of course, you're not going to hear any criticism within China about the Chinese Communist Party. If anybody has the temerity to do it, they're going to be, they're going to be crushed, as you saw it just in Hong Kong yesterday or the day before, right, where the party has already kind of rounded up the usual suspects, those who are advocates for the Hong Kong people having a say in how they're governed. And so I think we ought to be grateful for, as disappointed as we might be with some of the lack of preparation for this in the United States, we have a system that is self-correcting because the American people can voice their dissatisfaction with a government that is responsive to them because we do have a say in how we're governed. And so I think it's a time for us to obviously get through this crisis, to do everything we can to support those on the front line of it, the first responders and our healthcare workers in particular. But it's also a time for us, as we are critical of how we've responded and as we endeavor to get better, we have a chance to celebrate who we are as a people and celebrate our democratic principles and institutions and processes.
So I want to hone in on that a little more, since the question then is, how do we get there? And you, as part of the work you're doing for your new book, have written about or thinking a lot about what you call America's strategic narcissism. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is, how it's affected us during the pandemic, and how do we move forward?
Well, it's this tendency, strategic narcissism is this tendency to define the world only in relation to us, right? And one of the maladies associated with that is oftentimes we're given to wishful thinking. And I think with the Chinese Communist Party, what we have seen over the years is this belief that, hey, they're gonna become just like us. Well, actually, that word communist in China's Communist Party, it means something, right? It means that they are unwilling to entertain any kind of reform that would result in the loosening of its exclusive grip on power internally. So whereas we thought, in the 1990s, and not without some cause, during the Deng Xiaoping period, the reform period, the opening up, the time at which really the Chinese people were achieving remarkable, unprecedented growth rates in their economy, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, right? So there was some reason for optimism at that time. But what we should have known from Tiananmen Square in 1989, what we should have known from the fact that the party was not liberalizing its form of governance and was not playing by the rules economically either, is that this party was not going to reform in a way that would satisfy our assumptions. We'd assumed that China, as it prospered, would play by the rules internationally, as we welcomed China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, and then would liberalize its economy, shift from the statist economy and mercantilist practices to a free market economic system like ours. And then as China prospered even more, it would liberalize its form of government. And well, of course, we know now it did the opposite, right? It did the opposite. Didn't play by the rules, and in fact is actively subverting those rules internationally, and is trying to actually break apart the international system that has benefited actually China as well as the world, and replace it with a new system that's sympathetic to its interests. You see this with China's deliberate subversion of international organizations, such as, the Human Rights Council, the other small UN agencies, and then also large UN agencies. The World Health Organization is just one example of many, and there's a burgeoning body of scholarship on this about how China is really subverting the international order and trying to promote internationally this authoritarian and closed system.
So we've got questions flying in the chat already, and so I wanna ask you about one that you wrote recently in the Atlantic about China, but you're a broad strategic thinker and have been thinking about a lot of different parts of the world. And there's a question there about Russia. We haven't heard a lot about Russia in the context of this crisis. In some ways, what do you think Putin is up to? How is he seeking to exploit this, and what can we do about it?
Well, this is why I think the work of Prairie World House is important these days, more important than ever, because I think what we're going to see is that COVID-19 is going to act as a catalyst, an accelerant, I think, for a lot of geostrategic trends that were already ongoing. Hey, this was supposed to be a big year for Vladimir Putin. There was going to be a big celebration on the anniversary of the end of World War II and the victory over the Axis in Nazi Germany. It was supposed to be a big year because he was going to extend his rule until 2036 with this revision of the Constitution. But it's going to be a disappointing year for Vladimir Putin, and it's going to be disappointing for a number of reasons. First of all, the blow to what was already a stagnating economy, an economy stagnating because of the criminalized system that is in place in Russia, as well as sanctions imposed on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, and then also the depression in oil prices, right? So that which magnifies this really poorly conceived oil war with Saudi Arabia has led to an even more disastrous situation as global demand for oil is reduced and prices are falling to historic lows. So Russia also, of course, like the United States, other countries, is increasingly affected now by COVID-19. I think as that spreads into areas where there is not a robust health system, especially the rural areas of Russia, it's going to become even more problematic. I think the Russian people, as you know, who were already protesting last year about Putin's withdrawing from qualified candidates out of a municipal election, the Russian people were protesting because they want in how they're governed. They don't want Vladimir Putin to dictate everything in their country, and so there's going to be, I think, growing dissatisfaction in Russia. There's going to be growing calls from the people to have a say in how they're governed. And so I think we have to keep an eye on Russia. Russia may act out internationally as this happens, but I think also what you're seeing is some regret on the part of the Russian people that they supported this aggressive foreign policy. I mean, after Russia has helped Assad and the Iranians destroy Syria, who's going to rebuild it now, right? He's stuck with the bill, right? And he's going around the Middle East trying to get Saudi Arabia and the UAE to sign checks to rebuild it. I don't think anybody should spend a dollar in support of the Assad regime, and of course, by connection, their sponsor, the Russian and Iranian sponsors. The situation in Iran is related to this as well, as the Iranian economy is in free fall. Again, I don't think we should take credit for that with sanctions. I think we should give full credit to the mullahs who sit atop these bunyads and their corrupt system within Iran as well. Of course, oil prices affecting Iran, and the oil prices are really negatively affecting Venezuela, another Russian kind of client state. His support for Maduro is becoming more and more pricey. The Russian government just bailed out Rosneft in Venezuela to the tune of $4.1 billion. The Russian people aren't super happy about that, right? Because why should that money be going to this Russian adventure to support a brutal dictator in the Western Hemisphere, right? So I think it's going to be a bad year for Vladimir Putin. Hopefully, a good year for the Russian people as they demand a say in how they're governed and challenge his autocratic rule. It's one of the good things about Russia, right? Is elections still matter in Russia. Otherwise, right, Putin wouldn't spend so much money trying to rig the outcome, right? So I think there is
right, maybe an opportunity,
a real chance, right, for some reform there.
So let's shift from Russia to closer to home. And there's been, a lot of conversation about the U.S. government approach. I mean, I know your expertise is obviously more in foreign and military policy than domestic politics. But we had a question at the very beginning. I think the first question in asked, what would a strategy of sort of leveraging all elements of national power mean for the United States in responding to this pandemic? And what do you think we can do to better build U.S. government capacity to help us respond better?
Well, I'll tell you, it's an important question, obviously, and I think it's not too early to begin to glean the lessons from this, even as we're trying to get over the crisis itself. So when we were putting together the national security strategy and prioritizing really our efforts to prepare for threats and challenges to our security, we did put health security way up on the list, right? And this really began with George W. Bush when he read a book on pandemics and initiated a study within the government. And of course, right, SARS was scary, right? SARS was scary, and I think we got a maybe a false sense of security when that virus died out quickly before we really became a crisis, certainly for the United States. But we've really focused on three priority actions in the national security strategy. The first was global surveillance and trying to contain these problems at the source, right? So you saw that with Ebola, a very effective response, a U.S.-led response that prevented what was already a bad situation from getting much, much worse. But we were unable to do that in China, largely because of the cover-up, the lack of transparency, the dishonesty, the manipulation of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is something that the party's got to answer for, and that's really the suppression of the news of communal transmission of this virus. It is the shutting down of internal transportation before international travel is another decision that the party ought to answer for. And what we're seeing is that first priority action of global surveillance and being able to respond quickly. That is a priority task, and that's something that our diplomatic efforts have got to get behind, as well as the international health cooperation, which is still very strong. There's still strong infrastructure internationally, especially with like-minded countries, with bilateral, multilateral relationships outside of the WHO as well. The second priority action was to be able to mobilize for this crisis internally, right? We have to be able to get the equipment that we need, right? PPE and of course, and ventilators, the pharmaceuticals that are necessary. And this is where we saw really a failure, is that we didn't have enough of everything here. And I think what we're seeing is that, while there are tremendous advantages to our decentralized system, and you're seeing actually our decentralized system respond to this much better than at least initially the big federal government did. What we need is some kind of a hybrid approach to visibility of hospital beds, ICU beds, specialized equipment like ventilators, pharmaceutical stocks, and so forth. And we have to be able to then shift resources, across the country to get ahead of this kind of a wave. So if this ever happens again, we have to continue to fight it this way. I think getting the people there is important as well. So you don't want to activate maybe the Army Reserve, right? Because you're going to be pulling doctors out of positions that are already needed. So I think we need something different. And I'm working with a really neat organization called the U.S. Civilian Corps to develop a database for volunteers and a way for organizing those volunteers so that people who have the specialties that are most in demand, in this case, the medical specialty of respiratory therapist, for example, but also really expertise that cuts across really a number of competencies, the medical competency certainly, but we have people who know how to respond to crises. They know how to build teams on the fly and train them and make them cohesive. It's easy. It's relatively easy to build out the Javits Center in New York, right? But then how do you get the people there and have them organized in a way so they can run a hospital, right? And they understand that there's real practical issues, right? Like with COVID, every time somebody uses a bathroom, you have to clean the bathroom every time, right? That you need all the staples in for that hospital. How do you get oxygen in there? How do you admit patients, and how do you discharge patients? So you need people who understand the whole system, how to run that complex system, but they also have to understand how to work across departments and agencies, right? State, local, federal, break down those bureaucratic stovepipes, how to access complex logistics, supply chains. And we have people like that. And those people are largely the flag officers and senior officers who have run combat hospitals overseas, who have run Launchstool Medical Center at the height of the Afghan and Iraq wars. So some of the work we're doing is we're trying to identify these people and get them to where they're needed. One of the reasons why Washington State responded so well is Vice Admiral Rocky Bono, who has this competency, went there from Virginia and said, hey, how can I help? And so we're identifying some of these people. And so I think the second area, mobilization, okay, we need work there. We need a national dashboard, right, that has a lot of this information on it so that we don't have states and hospitals outbidding each other, right?
Competing with each other for supplies.
Right. And then the third area is innovation, right? The third party task was innovate to develop therapies, and especially though to be able to do the rapid prototyping of vaccines, and then to have the capacity to rapidly manufacture and distribute vaccines. I think that's going okay. Now, I'm not an expert on this, I've been tracked it day to day, but that's an area where we have put a lot of resources into. The U.S. government, other governments, the Gates Foundation, right? So I think that we have those three tasks I think are still relevant, right? Global surveillance and getting it to it at the source early, mobilizing our resources to cope, with a crisis, and then innovation. And of those, the second priority task is where we disappointed, the government disappointed. And I think the good news is, when we saw the gap, people rallied to it, right? People like, Dr. Burke, who you see now on the National Security Council staff, she comes in to help. The countless people who have rolled up their sleeves, and said, hey, put me to work. These nurses that are flying from Atlanta to New York. I mean, it's amazing what the resiliency of our country, the goodness of the American people, So I have great confidence in us, to get through this thing, to learn from it. And I think we're in a position of comparative advantage, right? Because we can criticize, government response, and we can get better. I don't think the Chinese Communist Party is going to tolerate much of that kind of frank discussion.
So let me ask a follow-up that gets to some of these U.S. capacity questions and how we make choices about what to spend on in, when we, in a world of uncertainty? And this question actually comes from Andy Moravchik, who's a professor at Princeton and a visiting scholar, I think a distinguished visiting scholar at Perry Worldhouse this year. And, he asks, in politics, money is limited. Over the last 10 years, the US has spent a lot more addressing military threats than preparing for the threat of a global pandemic. Does this make sense? If not, what is to be done about it? How should we think about essentially how to allocate resources when, there are these different kinds of challenges to address?
I think what you're seeing is the continuation of a trend that a historian C. Van Woodward wrote about in the American Historical Review in 1960, right? Woodward was writing actually about the turn of the 19th century, 19th to the 20th century, and in an essay called I think the Age of Reinterpretation was the name of the essay, but he was writing about the end of the age of free security for North America and the United States, and he was talking about the aerospace revolution and so forth, and how these great moats of the Atlantic and Pacific, no longer gave us the kind of security that we thought we had, from events that occurred abroad, right, and developments abroad. Of course, the two world wars, were a big wake up to that fact. But now I think then, of course, the advent of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and so it's now clear to all of us that security threats, military security threats, are best deterred abroad before you get to the stage of war. And this is why we've invested a lot in our overseas military presence and our alliances abroad, which to convince potential enemies that they cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force. So I think that this applies to pandemics. We know that with threats in cyberspace, threats to space, that we have to be active and engaged to deter, prevent these threats, or to contain them if necessary. And so I think we have to maybe break down, some of the stovepipe thinking about defense, and include, in this case, pandemics. And so what would we do if we break down some of those stovepipes? We might reconfigure the National Guard and the Army Reserve, right? We might think about how do we build capabilities in the National Guard that are deployable for overseas contingencies, but are really mainly focused on coping with this kind of a crisis internally. What kind of specialties do we need in the National Guard for that purpose? Maybe the Army Reserve, becomes more focused on combat capabilities with some of these capabilities. And I mentioned already, we need maybe a U.S. civilian corps, that I think would be very compatible with the Presidential Commission on National Service that just delivered a very good report. And I think you see it at University of Pennsylvania. I see it at Stanford. There is an untapped desire to serve among our young people, and I think the younger generation, sometimes by older people, not you, Mike, you're still very young, but older people like me, I mean, they get unfairly criticized. I think that these are some extraordinary young Americans who want to serve, and I think this might give us an opportunity to give them a pathway to service.
So here's a question that a couple different people have asked in different forms. So I'm going to paraphrase through a couple. And there's I think the perception of a trend since the end of the Obama administration, I would even say a trend, that the world's been moving more away from some of the international institutions that we founded in the wake of World War II, more toward focus on national sovereignty. And there are, some people that seem to suggest that the coronavirus crisis will accelerate these trends. There are others that seem to, hope that this could, provide a wake-up call, essentially, for leaders to become more cooperative. How do you see this playing out on some of these sort of broader trends that we've seen and that you participated in shaping policy on as National Security Advisor?
Right. I think it's going to accelerate the trend toward more nationalistic and less supranationalistic, sentiment, and I think you see that already playing out in Europe, right? I mean, Donald Trump gets blamed for a lot of the problems within the EU, but I mean they predated even Donald Trump, But I think that it's in our interest, it's in U.S. interest to have really strong sovereign states who respect the sovereignty of their people and the sovereignty of their neighbors. It's also, I think, in our interest to have strong multilateral institutions, especially institutions that bring together like-minded countries. Those who those who do have democratic governance and adhere to rule of law and respect individual rights and freedom of speech and freedom of religion and tolerance. And so I think I think that these organizations are more important than ever. But we have to recognize, hey, there's no prize for membership in these organizations, and oftentimes these organizations are battlegrounds themselves, right? They are contested spaces where authoritarian governments try to advance, their own agendas. I mean, just look what China has done with the human rights, the Human Rights
Sure.
Council. I mean, they don't even allow human rights activists to visit the offices of the Human Rights Council in New York, and we saw this, of course, with the WHO, but we see it with the environment as well, like how China, I mean, Xi Jinping will get, every time he gives a speech, he'll mention environment 19 times,
Right.
while they're building, 260 some coal-fired plants, while they're blocking within the UN development programs, sustainable development goals. They're writing out, they're writing out language that would highlight these violations and covering up the environmental abuses under the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think we just can't look to international organizations because of their existence to be good. I think we ought to be skeptical about terms, and sorry, Perry Worldhouse, but I mean terms like global governance. It is. I think it is in large measure a figment of our imagination, right? And it is in large measure a figment of our imagination because Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they're not waiting to be led, right, by a global body that is virtuous. They're just not. So I think I don't think we need to take a dystopian view of this and think
Sure.
that we can have international cooperation. International cooperation is more important than ever, but we have to recognize the competitive aspect of this. And what I'm concerned about more even though than the growth of kind of nationalist movements, although I am concerned about that, especially the jingoistic ones that are sort of oftentimes range toward bigotry and lack of tolerance and so forth. But I'm also very concerned with isolationist sentiment growing within the United States in a way that's not partisan. Okay, but George Soros and Charles Koch together. I mean, that's crazy, right? But there's an alliance between those two billionaires who otherwise would be politically opposed to one another behind a neo-isolationist movement. And they're funding these think tanks that essentially, I think, are paragons of what I've called in this book, strategic narcissism, in that they define the world only in relation to us, and therefore argue that our disengagement from complex problem sets is an unmitigated good. And they argue this in large measure because they see us as the problem rather than the solution. And I think that what we're learning is that our security, whether it's from a pandemic or whether it's from potentially hostile states, we can't withdraw our defenses to the water's edge. It just won't work. And so I think alliances are more important than ever. I think cooperative relationships, especially like with the G7 and other like-minded countries, is more important than ever to get out of the economic crisis associated with this, prevent the next pandemic from happening. But we have to not be complacent about it. We have to compete within these organizations, and especially band together with like-minded countries, and hopefully by competing effectively, convince others, the Chinese Communist Party, Iran, others, to change their policies and behavior.
So let me actually jump in. The next question I was going to ask is exactly where you ended, and it comes from the woke visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse, Ambassador Sandy Birchbow, who says that one of America's historic advantages has been its system of alliances. And to paraphrase, how can we better leverage those alliances? A lot of people have been concerned that we've been driving wedges in them over the last few years instead of reinforcing them. And if they are very important, as you've said, what should we be doing differently maybe, and how can we leverage our allies and partners in the response to coronavirus?
Well, I would just say it's not as bad as most people think, okay, in terms of alliances. Now, you have a large measure a reaction, I think, to some of President Trump's language, right, and what some people see as insulting language toward allies. But the basis of his statements and his efforts with allies has been more on burden sharing. Well, I mean, that goes back to the 70s, right, with NATO. And I think with countries like Germany, who's a great ally, and has been for decades, and is critical to the transatlantic alliance and the strength of Europe, and as we're seeing now, right, as Germany shifted its fiscal policy in a way that is vitally important to responding to the economic crisis in Europe, but Germany has to take more responsibility. And also recognize that endeavors like Nord Stream 2, for example, with Russia, that gives Russia coercive power through the control of energy supply in Europe. It really is something that we have to have these hard conversations about, right? It's okay to argue within alliances. It's okay, for us to try to make them stronger. I think when President Macron said, "Hey, NATO's brain dead," right? I mean, I think we should use that. We should use that to help make NATO better, to strengthen our alliances. Now, the argument that you're hearing more and more from kind of the neo-isolationist crowd, and this is on both sides of the political spectrum, right? This isn't a Republican-Democrat problem, right? This is an American problem, is we have to do a better job at explaining to the American people how our alliances actually reduce the burden on us, which they do, and they have the benefit of preserving peace and also really strengthening our voice and our influence internationally. I mean, most people don't know. I mean, the defense budget of NATO countries without the United States dwarfs the defense budget of Russia, right? And so, how much would we have to spend on defense if we didn't have a strong relationship within NATO, for example? So I just think that what is required at this stage is better communication. This is why Perry Worldhouse, what you do is so important, to help explain to the American people what are the tangible but also the less tangible benefits of our alliances.
So let's sorry, I was going to say let's shift from allies and partners back to some of America's adversaries and potential adversaries. We had a lot of questions come in about Russia and China, including one from Trudy Rubin, who's a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, who wants to know what you think the best way, or how should the U.S. be approaching, what she says are China's errors and lack of transparency on COVID-19. I mean, you mentioned this at the beginning of your remarks, and I think it's well known at that point, regardless of what one thinks about what the U.S. should do about that. But how should we be thinking about what blame do we give them, and what does that mean from an international politics perspective?
Great. Well, Trudy is just a very wise person. I mean, actually, Trudy, I mentioned you in the introduction of my book. I talk about the day that I was walking down Walnut Street on my way to FPRI, and later that day to have a visit at Penn with you, Mike. And my phone rang, asked me to go to the White House. So Trudy and I had a conversation at that point, and I think Trudy's work has been just tremendous over the years. She's always been ahead of things, right? And her book Willful Blindness, which is a number of her essays, is really written about going into Iraq in 2003. Willfully blind, right? Overly optimistic, and people want to debate about Iraq, right? Why should we have done it in Iraq in 2003? I think what we ought to debate about Iraq is who the heck thought it would be easy, right? And why did they think it would be easy? But I think willful blindness, to borrow Trudy's phrase, there is part of this phenomenon of strategic narcissism, right? Defining the world as we would like it to be, and then assuming that it's going to be that way. And I think this has been the problem with China. I think you have those who defend the Chinese Communist Party say, "Well, Gus, we're so insulting to the Chinese Communist Party. We've insulted Xi Jinping." I mean, no, we're just actually telling the truth, right? Which is what the Chinese Communist Party, in large measure, may actually fear the most, right? So I think what we have to do is pull the curtain back on the party's behavior. We have to be strong about this. I mean, heck, I mean, this is a government that has put 1 to 3 million people in concentration camps and re-education camps. This is a country that is stifling any inkling of individual freedom. This is a country that, and really a party, I should say, the Chinese Communist Party, which has erected this great firewall to prevent any kind of truth from getting in to the country, while it mounts a sustained campaign of disinformation and propaganda and political subversion, using social media platforms in the United States, by the way, that are denied access even to the Chinese market. So I think that we have to get better at exposing this. I'll tell you, it seems like we are so preoccupied oftentimes at self-flagellation, criticizing ourselves. We're very willing to criticize ourselves, and that's a strength of our culture. But it seems that there are many who think that, well, if we criticize the Chinese Communist Party, we're going to hurt their feelings. Well, actually, we owe it to the Chinese people and the peoples of the world who are, I think, in many ways afflicted by China's now export of this authoritarian model, with the debt trap that they're setting, for example, for countries to step into, the fostering of corrupt authoritarian regimes. I mean, it used to be people cared, right, about human rights in Africa, for example. Look at Zimbabwe. Look what China's done in Zimbabwe. Does anybody care about that? How about shining the light on some of these examples? I think what we will see is how they subverted the World Health Organization. That'll come out. Many of you may have seen the video, the abhorrent video of the interview between a Taiwanese journalist and a senior official in the World Health Organization who wouldn't even say the word Taiwan, right? And so I think it's really time for all of us to speak up. And actually, I think it's going to happen. I mean, I think China feels like it's winning in this propaganda wars. Many of you may have seen the cover of The Economist and read in The Economist this issue. The Economist, as they do the balanced kind of view of this. But you have one of the apologists, right, for China, one of the most vocal international apologists, Kishore Mahbubani, for example, has he writes these long essays, the polemic essays, has China won, right? Now, the last one was like, hey, the West is over, basically, right? Well, hey, I don't think so, right? And I think what you see in Germany, where the editor of a major German paper just put out a video, a blog, calling out the Chinese Communist Party for its behavior. The German government's talking about sending a bill to the Chinese Communist Party. You've seen those, who unwisely in the UK we're going to let the Chinese Communist Party wheel in this Trojan horse of Huawei to lay in their 5G infrastructure and to get access to really important data, right? I mean, I just don't understand like how people in the UK and other places would expect the Chinese Communist Party to treat them better than they treat their own citizens, right? It's not going to happen. And so now there's growing concern about that in the UK. I think the pendulum's going to swing back in favor of our free and open societies. And what we ought to do is reach out to each other, right? Hug each other tighter, have even closer cooperation, with Europe and with Japan, with India and others to work together on this problem, and also to continue to try to cooperate with China, but at the same time, calling out what are unacceptable practices of the Chinese Communist Party. But I think it's a time of opportunity here.
So let me follow up with a question that gets into the information campaigns that both Russia and China have been running against the United States in multiple dimensions, including in the coronavirus area. So you've talked a little bit about China in this regard. Maybe you could say a little bit about Russia. How, and let me to phrase it as a question: how should we be thinking about how should we prioritize cybersecurity from a national security perspective? What should that mean given your understanding of the bureaucracy of the foreign policy process?
Right. Okay. So there are various threats that operate in cyberspace. Of course, that there are offensive threats that go against infrastructure that relies on the movement of data in cyberspace. We've seen attacks, right, on our financial infrastructure In this case, there was a sustained attack by the Iranians, a few years back. You have the possibility of attacks on transportation infrastructure, electrical grids, and so forth. On seasons, right? In 2016 and beyond, and of course, going back to 2007, Russia has been perfecting some of these techniques after the denial of service attacks on Estonia back then. So I think that's one category of attacks, and I think what you've seen are some significant policy changes that make us much more effective at defending that infrastructure. Especially, I think, a recognition that, hey, you can't have, just like in war, any kind of competition, you can't have a good defense without a good offense, right? And so I think policy changes have been positive in that connection, and I think you couldn't have a better person, leading the NSA and Cyber Command. I think we're very serious about that defense, and I think you're seeing companies take this a lot more seriously. I think what we have to be cognizant of, everybody's working at home now. Our vulnerability to offensive cyber capabilities, data theft, attacking, our routine operations. I mean, it's grown, I think, by orders of magnitude. So I think this is an area that businesses should not cut back on. The other area, though, that I think you're alluding to, Mike, is this cyber-enabled information warfare. Yep. That really aims to decrease our confidence in who we are as a people, to polarize us, yep, hit us against each other, right? And diminish our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And this is a fight that every American has to be on the front line on. And the way that we have to do this is education, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, what does it mean for every American to be on the front lines of this?
Well, it means that an educated populace is a heck of a lot less vulnerable to this kind of disinformation and propaganda. So, I mean, every elementary, secondary school teacher, professor, especially like in humanities, I mean, ought to be equipping our people to evaluate the information that they take in on social media and in education. I think is the first step, and then it's very important for us to have trusted has evolved in recent years. We have in some measure become less and less effective. Have become less and less effective at countering disinformation and propaganda because of the way that our politics is so contested as well. So I just think that I think that it's an opportunity for us to have conversations across the political spectrum to insulate ourselves from this disinformation. What Russia's doing is egregious, right? What Russia what Russia has, but it's not unprecedented again. Remember when AIDS, when the first AIDS breakout occurred. Back, this is the still the KGB back then, right? The KGB, spread rumors that this was the U.S. military that had done it. Well, I mean, what they're doing, they're spreading the same kind of disinformation now. China's, has joined in on it. So I think there have to be sanctions for this kind of activity. What you've seen, I think, is the Department of Justice is getting much better at these kind of investigations. I think the Mueller report was very effective at pulling the curtain back. Of course, everybody wanted to focus on the issues associated with the impeachment of the president. Man, look, it's time now to just get beyond that. Look at what Russia did, and look at what we have to do. No matter what your political beliefs are, no matter what you think about Donald Trump. I mean, there's a lot that we have to do to protect ourselves against the threat that's laid out in that report. And I think the indictments against the individuals associated with it are important. The sanctions that you've seen the U.S. and others put on these individuals. You've seen similar work actually against APT-10, which is the hacking entity within China. December 2018, 15 different countries, I think it was 14 or 15 countries sanctioned that entity, individuals associated with it. And there were indictments as well. And so there is a high degree of international cooperation going on in this area. And we have to continue to fight it. But I think, Aristotle said, focus on what is in your control, and you can get a lot done. Let's think about what we can control. We can control, how educated we are in these issues. We can control how we speak to each other, right? I wish that every time we talk about what divides us, politically, especially going into this presidential election, let's give at least equal time to what we can agree on, right? Because there's so much we can agree on, and so much that we can get done to improve our country and to improve our confidence in ourselves.
So on that Aristotle comment makes me think, one things we can control. One of the things you used to have some control over, but no longer do, is the Trump administration strategy. And we've had a lot of questions in the asking for sort of your thoughts on the Trump administration's response, and sort of how they've done. And how would you grade the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic, both maybe from a national security perspective and otherwise?
Well, I think that that the Trump administration has done a lot to, I think, lay a foundation for what could be, if anybody could imagine it, right, a bipartisan foreign policy, right? I mean, I think it's clear now that strategic engagement with China under the belief that, hey, they're going to liberalize, it didn't work out, right? So we have to compete effectively with China. I think you've seen, the maintenance and extension of sanctions on Russia to disincentivize, to convince the Kremlin to give up its campaign of subversion against the United States, going from strategic patience on North Korea to maximum pressure. I mean, so there are a lot of policy issues that I agree with, but I think what you see is you see this tendency, right? This tendency within the administration, because of, I think, part of who the president's political base is this deep skepticism of government broadly, this suspicion, right, of civil servants, this deep state narrative and so forth. And it's, I think that's very damaging, right? Now there was a failure, I think, of the administrative state, right, of departments and agencies to prepare for this, but that doesn't mean that we should that we should abandon the federal government's efforts to prepare for the next one. We have to just be more effective at it, and I think that I think that what we have to do is regain confidence in government, especially at the federal level, and do that by reform. Now, one of the interesting dynamics within the Trump administration has been how the National Security Council staff is regarded, for example. And I think there are those who felt as if the National Security Council staff is part of this deep state problem set, where you're going to have civil servants who cast themselves in the role of resisting the president, of saving the country from the president, like this anonymous writer. When in fact the National Security Council staff, if configured properly, is necessary, because it is the only place where you can really break down all of those departmental stovepipes, right? So I think what you saw with the response to this, to this pandemic, is the need for an effective National Security Council staff. Now, that always happens in crisis, right? I mean, if you go back to the founding of the National Security Council staff, Harry Truman didn't like it. He's like, what do I need that thing for, right? And then after the Korean War, he's chairing an NSC meeting every week because he saw, hey, to fight this war, we have to coordinate across departments and agencies. Actually, NSC 68, the provision for the NSC staff, that came out of really the lessons learned from Pearl Harbor, right? So I think it's important to understand that the entities within our government that help the departments and agencies be more effective by coordinating efforts. And I think what we're seeing is when that breaks down, and you don't have HHS and defense and from an economic perspective, commerce and treasury and everybody involved in a routine way on this, that you could be less prepared than you should be for this kind of a problem set. So I don't know. A lot of this will come out. I think there ought to be an inquiry into this, a bipartisan one, like there was after 9/11, and take a look at how do we become more effective. And like everything in Washington, right? I mean, I think there's some policy people in Washington maybe think, hey, if you write it, on this piece of paper, it's gonna get done. Well, actually, you know what? The most important part of any strategic plan is the implementation of it, right? And so I think there will be a drive toward more effective implementation as well.
So how do we, in that context, and I sort of have a follow-up here about the pandemic response, in the NSC, which obviously there's been a lot of conversation about, but I think that connects to a broader question about a couple people have asked questions about what somebody called the securitization of healthcare, and the extent to which we should be thinking about healthcare and pandemic response sort of as a defense and national security issue or as more of a domestic issue. And how, from your perspective, how should we be thinking about that? And how did you think about that when you were National Security Advisor?
Well, we had thought about it, and I thought about it even before I went into the NSC, the National Security Advisor job, as maybe a response to a bio threat, right? How do we prepare? How do we prepare for that? And of course, that is something we have to keep an eye on as well. And of course, the preparation you do for a pandemic. A naturally occurring pandemic is compatible with what you would have to do against a bio threat. But I think that that what we've seen is that we are inherently decentralized, right? We're a federal system. You have state and local governance, and then you have federal government. And I think what is going to be most important going forward from this is to identify what tasks have to be accomplished at a centralized level. I mentioned some of those already, right? Better visibility of our resources, and an ability to shift resources more effectively to points of need. But I don't think the answer, and I've not studied this completely. I don't think anybody has yet. But I don't think the answer to what we've seen as really disappointing preparation at a centralized level should lead us to conclude we need more centralization, right? I think what we need is how do we better leverage the strengths of our decentralized systems and galvanize a response and shift resources to points of need. And as I mentioned, if those three tasks are still those that we have to focus on, which is better surveillance and
Right.
getting to the problem at the source. Well, that means we'll need deployable capabilities. We'll need a high degree of international cooperation to do this. Certainly a lot more cooperation than we got from the Chinese Communist Party early in this problem set. And the second is how do we mobilize the people and the resources we need to respond. That's where I think that we need the greatest amount of work. And then the third area is innovation. But I don't think that improvements to that second area, right, of mobilizing, I don't think that answer is centralization. I think we have to, what we're seeing the governors and the federal government and the president and everybody figure this out, right? They're figuring out on the fly, which is not the preferable way to do it, right? Learning from experience is always the hardest way to learn, right? But I think that we will have demonstrated best practices on the back end of this, and we're bound to be much better prepared in the future.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because you have this national dashboard idea that you mentioned before that might, that in some ways that suggests more sort of federal government authority. So how do we create that sort of dashboard, that sort of federal organized response while still preserving our more sort of decentralized structure, since that's been such an advantage for the United States historically? Yeah.
Well, I think this is probably something pretty easy to do, right? So there are all sort of there are a lot of new technologies that make this very simple. Of course, you'd want to have redundant systems and systems that can degrade and so forth. But there are systems that are in place in hospitals. Now they're not uniform and they don't talk to each other and so forth. That track the number of hospital beds, the number that are open, the number of ICU beds, the number of ventilators, the stocks of PPE and pharmaceuticals and so forth. So I think that we have a combination of a public and private system and research hospitals and systems that are monitored and standards that are enforced within states. But what we need is we need to be able to elevate understanding, right, of what the situation is, so we can allocate resources. There needs to be some capacity that's mobile across lines, like the hospital ship the Army field hospitals that responded in New York, right? I mean,
Right.
tremendous capabilities, and so we know we need that, right? And of course we need some uniform standards, right? One of the impediments has been licensure regulations for for nurses and doctors, right? So we probably need some federal standards for that all the states can buy in on, right? And so there are already a lot of lessons emerging. So I think that there's a way to do this that will really just glean the lessons we've learned, identify where the gaps existed, and close those gaps with policy, or with material solutions. Like, hey, stockpile more stuff, right? I mean, more PPE.
So you've given us an optimistic note domestically, and so let me take you out as a last question on asking you to speculate optimistically globally. If, say, 2 years from now, the United States is in a relatively better position than it was prior to the crisis. So, essentially, as people are starting to look back and do first drafts of history, they're like, wow, things ended pretty well for the U.S. And it's kind of rough for China's influence. Take me through what has to happen to get to that more sort of optimistic outcome.
Well, of course, we have an economic crisis that we're facing, right? And I'm not an economist, so I can't really comment credibly about this, except we have to get out. We have to get out of this. We have to get growth going again, and I think we have to do so in a way that does not increase divisions, right? Especially between our free and open and free market economies, and of course this disparity in financial disparities in Europe, for example, are pretty severe. What the European Central Bank has done, I think is good, appropriate. Will that be enough? So I think it's going to be a lot of really effort to provide support for national solutions to the economic crisis first. And then I think to reestablish, really more confidence in who we are as a people and our democratic institutions and processes. And I think we all have that in our power to do it. I mean, I really think that we ought to reject, the kind of the fringe that you see among political elites and maybe in the media at times, elements of the media, the pseudo media, and come together as a people. I really think that we have an opportunity to do that. And of course, we're talking internationally, and I think that means with those who share our democratic principles and institution and confidence in rule of law and so forth. And
Sure.
That's really the opportunity, I think.
So
go ahead.
No.
I was going to say there's some dangers though that go beyond economic dangers. I think what you've seen is China become even more aggressive as this pandemic is going on, right? With more and more violations of Taiwanese airspace, for example, more aggressive activity in the South China Sea. You saw yesterday, right? They named another 400 islands or whatever it was in the South China Sea. So I think we have to be vigilant from a deterrence perspective, and we ought to take the opportunity to strengthen our alliance relationships and our ability to deter what we could be a devastating confrontation, right? That nobody wants.
Right.
As this pandemic flows into the into developing economies, of course there are a number of crises that could occur there. I will point out, okay, that despite the narrative you hear internationally, in March, the Trump administration, President Trump signed $1.3 billion of additional assistance, mainly to developing economies on the health crisis. And then just a few weeks later, Secretary Pompeo announced another $274 million, I believe, dollars that are oriented to pandemic response in developing economies. The United States dwarfs, we dwarf any other contributions to the international organizations that have really a stake in this response. So we ought to be proud of that, and I think we ought to try to emphasize, as Perry Worldhouse does, in the way that you reach out internationally to any of our international contacts, that we have to be in this together, and we ought to try to don't let this crisis go to waste, right? And to use it, to foster greater cooperation among like-minded nations. And I'll just say finally, inside of the United States, we ought to look at this as a way, to to emphasize better equality of opportunity in the United States.
Sure.
And I think you've seen these kind of discussions around, how do we structure, the relief bills and so forth at the federal level. But this is something we can all have a hand in as well, right? Is doing everything we can within our communities to make sure everybody has a shot, at a better future for them and their families.
So if you have maybe time for one lightning round, a bonus question, some people have said that the pandemic is in some ways like 9/11, that it'll force a complete reorienting of the U.S. government's national security focus for years or decades to come. What's your take on that? And that question comes from Ed Wong from the New York Times.
Yeah, well, I think he's right. I mean, I think that this has highlighted really an area that we have to pay more attention to. And this is, how do we deal with a kind of a widespread civil disaster too? I mean, this is an area that we hadn't focused on. It overlaps with the response to 9/11, but of course this is more of a protracted experience, right? And it's affecting all of the country simultaneously. 9/11 did too, of course. With near 3,000 people dying, and so many people, of course, knowing people who died in that mass murder attack, and it took trillions of dollars out of the economy and so forth. But I do think this is going to be change the way we think about security. And
right.
What I hope it does is it sort of erases the kind of mental model that we have of homeland security being one thing, and then overseas security being something else, right? In this interconnected world, right? There is no way to just to kind of pull up the drawbridge, and think we're going to be okay. And this is why I think this, these people who kind of they define themselves as realists, but they're really ideologues who advocate for American disengagement from the world. I think that they make a point sometimes, when they're skeptical about maybe international organizations and ideas like global governance, and say that's over optimistic. But they go too far, when they think that America can advance the interest of its citizens and protect its citizens by disengaging from the world. We just have to engage more effectively, I think.
So with that, I want to thank you for joining us today, and thank everybody for tuning in. We really appreciate it. We've had Lieutenant General H.R. retired H.R. McMaster, a former national security advisor, with us on this edition of The World Today. And for those of you on, we hope you'll join us tomorrow, where at 12 p.m. we'll have a focus on global governance, HR's favorite term, in the context of pandemic response specifically, looking at organizations like the World Health Organization and their response. We'll have Professor Harvey Rubin and Professor Julie Lynch, both from the University of Pennsylvania, joining us. We hope you'll tune in for that at 12 p.m. But for now, hope you all join me in thanking H.R. McMaster, and have a great day. Thanks a lot, sir.
Hey, thanks. It was great being with you, Mike. Take care, everybody.